Hello, this is Samuel. This is finally the vaunted part 3 of 3. We finally made it. This is now going to be the ultimate showdown. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty versus the Constantinian Dynasty. In my previous two videos, I've gone over both the Julio-Claudians and the Constantinians, and so now it's time to finally see who ranks out and comes out on top. Now again, this is my own assessment, so if you disagree, you're more than entitled to do so, and you may know something that I don't, and that might make your opinion a bit different than mine. But if you do disagree, let me know in the comments why you think so. There's a lot to go back and forth on, and I think that there is an argument to make that even if not the Constantinian dynasty, at least Constantine himself, perhaps as an individual, was greater than whatever, right? There's lots to go over. This is just my opinion on this. And before we do jump into the results, I just want to rehash a point that had kind of crossed my mind as to what would qualify or disqualify a bit for each dynasty, which is, of course, that each dynasty is, they take place over different periods of time. The Constantinian dynasty is about 60 years or so, and the Julio-Claudian dynasty is about 80. That in itself won't become as much of a factor. Like just the number of years, I'm not ranking it. Well, the Julio-Claudians were longer, therefore they're better. I'm not going to do that. But the self-preservation is definitely something that I do want to, make sure is accounted for. Let's see. I think that's everything from my notes. So let's hop to it. We're going to just rehash some of the points that had been previously made about each dynasty, and then after that, we're going to have one final slide that will be the big reveal who I think is the greater of the two dynasties. So let's start with the Julio-Claudians. So what I've kind of done is I've given some pluses and some minus, some positives and some negatives. And I think that first and foremost, the biggest plus for the Julio-Claudians is obviously Augustus, without a doubt. No doubt in my mind, and probably if you look at it in any way historically, no doubt in anyone's mind, that he is indeed the greatest Roman emperor to have ever walked the earth. Of course, he had the distinct advantage of being able to mold the office based on what he surmised would be necessary in order to maintain order across the empire, which, of course, the vision of the empire as a whole is something that we have to obviously credit for him as well. He was constantly concerned for the succession, which sets a good precedent, which kind of reaches its apex with the Antonine Dynasty, this constant appointment of great virtuous guys who will become the next emperors. And he was so good at his job as an emperor that, people asked him to take on more powers, and he declined because he thought they were unnecessary. And of course, well, this just increases your popularity. Look how modest he is, the divine Augustus. I think the next great plus is what I would kind of put in brackets as idiot-proof, which is the fact that despite having individuals like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero holding the office of emperor, the system was kind of too big to fail. I don't know if that's the correct way to say it, but it was able to survive with having idiots in the office. The empire was able to be maintained even with a tyrant like Tiberius, or a sadist like Caligula, or somebody as apathetic towards the office as Nero. And of course, we had talked about vision before, but vision is another big plus. There's a clear vision of the imperial boundaries at the borders. There's foresight to see that extending would be a problem. Of course, the main function of the legions would then be to protect Roman territory rather than to conquer new territory. If you overexpand, you won't have enough resources to make sure that you can maintain those borders. And of course, probably one of the biggest things for your average Roman citizen was stability. The imperial system would, by and large, endure in Rome until 476 AD. That was when the last emperor was deposed and no more emperor was elected, or chosen, or succeeded. This, of course, proved to immediately stop the civil wars that were happening, and it would take a very long time for civil wars to really become a mainstay again in Roman history. Enough power was in the hands of one person to maintain order effectively without people getting, crazy about it. As many good things as there are for the Julio-Claudians, now is the time when we go into the negatives. And of course, the first big negative that I have is 3 names. Could you guess which ones they are? If you guessed Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, you are 100% correct. Now, these are definitely some of the lesser emperors of Rome. Tiberius probably doesn't really deserve to be on this list just because of how he proved to be a capable individual. He just wasn't really cut out for the job. And I don't think he really had hoped for it, and I don't think anybody had wanted it for him. Nero probably ranks on the same level as Tiberius if you don't count the Christian persecutions. I think that is a pretty steady argument that most people kind of generally liked him, but the Christian persecutions kind of put people over the edge, especially, of course, Christians today, right? You can't really like Nero because of what he did. And then, I think with the Christian persecutions, if you were to discount that, Nero would probably be okay, but counting it, he's probably on Caligula levels of bad. And of course, Caligula is like definitely in the top 5 for worst emperors, so you can't really mix it any other way. The next big negative, I would say, is probably the inability to conquer Germania. The massacre of the Teutoburg Forest was particularly gruesome, and losing 3 legions and all is terrible. And unfortunately, what it did is it basically just broke the Roman spirit from ever seriously attempting to annex Germania. And the failure to make it to Augustus's ideal borders shouldn't have really been left alone. There was the reason why Augustus had wanted to make the Elbe River the ideal imperial borders and not the Rhine, because of course there are problems with the Rhine, namely that, well, it leaves a huge chunk of your empire exposed, and it was exposed. And this is a problem that Romans would constantly have to face as long as the empire was around. It was a constant thorn in the side of the empire. And probably what I would say is the biggest negative, probably the biggest downside of the Julio-Claudians, is that there were no clear succession guidelines. This is probably the biggest bad thing. And this is something that would indeed plague the Romans basically for the entirety of the empire. The handpicking of emperors works well when strong and good emperors choose strong and good men who will become strong and good emperors. The Nerva-Antonine Dynasty is the high point of this. But as we see in the years of 4, 5, and 6 emperors, it often comes down to a power struggle which weakens the empire by pitting, good military commanders against each other in order to secure unity for the empire. And of course, there's a whole lot of bad things when you have your own people fighting each other and weakening yourself. So that's what I would have to say for the Julio-Claudians. Overall, I gave my previous sentiment on my previous video on them, so you can check that out for a little bit more detail. This was just kind of a quick rehashing, but now we'll go over to the Constantinian Dynasty. Like with the Julio-Claudians, the first big plus that I have to give, the first big positive, is of course Constantine. He was one of the most capable and well-rounded emperors to rule. He was strong militarily and politically. He was highly competent, and really only he could have done what he did, which is kind of bring the empire back into one, having one emperor, one empire, one god. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. The second big thing, obviously, is the legalization of Christianity. This is huge. I mean, the empire had kind of been tearing itself apart by persecuting, 10% of the population for basically no reason. And that 10% of which was kind of at all levels and ranks of the empire. So really, you're kind of, attacking a lot of loyal Romans for no reason, and you're weakening yourself when you could channel that energy and aggression to actually defending and maintaining the empire instead. So, Constantine really saved a lot of trouble, and given the rise that Christianity was on, obviously it's the best choice, and of course, well, Christianity is true, so he made the correct choice to support the one true religion. The third big thing is, obviously, I haven't mentioned it yet, it's the founding of Constantinople. This is kind of one of the 2 great innovations of Constantine. He moved the capital to the more prosperous east, and he was able to more easily access the Danube front and also the Sassanids to the east. Constantinople as a city itself is quite remarkable in that it essentially lasted from Constantine's founding in about 330, I believe, to 1453, and the only reason why Constantinople fell was because cannons at that point made the massive Theodosian walls of Constantinople basically useless. So it took until about 1,000 years of technological change for Constantinople really to kind of face serious loss. The third big plus, or I guess what is this, the 4th plus now? Yeah, it's the 4th, would be military reforms. Constantine reformed the military to have a different hierarchy, which allowed for the position of Magister Militum, or basically military dictator, to have a very high position, second only in the empire to the emperor. And for those of us who are familiar with the history of the Western Empire, the Magister Militum is a very important person indeed. And competent Magister Militums would hold the West together until eventually it fell in 476. This brings us to our negative points, however, and I would like to go over these once again. The first being family failures. The death of Crispus has got to go down as one of the terrible tragedies that the empire ever faced. Crispus was essentially the spitting image of his father, equally competent in military and politics, and yet he was 31 years old when he was executed by his father. Had he lived, he would have been 42 when his father, Constantine, had passed away. And so it makes one wonder what basically a second Constantine would have done for the Constantinian Dynasty. Perhaps there wouldn't have been any shifting around, and there would have been a permanent and much longer link for the Constantinian Dynasty. It was a huge loss. And the family tradition of killing each other was resurrected, of course, by Constantius II when he put the dynasty in a pickle, when everybody else had died out, by killing all of his other male relatives. More so than their enemies, the Constantinians really destroyed themselves. Now, this is another big fault, and this would be what I call the reinstitution of a type of tetrarchy, although there weren't 4 emperors in this case, there were 3, his 3 sons. Despite having resulted in a catastrophic failure previously that Constantine himself had to fix, he went right back to the divide the empire model, very unwisely in my opinion. Only one of his sons proved to have serious metal at being emperor. One was a failure, basically died in 3 years, and the other, Constans, was okay. He lasted a little bit, but nothing remarkable. The empire once again was reconsolidated under a single emperor. As much as having multiple emperors helps get more work done, it also means that you need more competent people, which is asking quite a lot. The next big fault, I believe this is the third big fault, is the abandoning of the West. Moving to Constantinople, as great as it was, did have consequences in regards to alienating the West, where direct oversight was definitely still needed, especially on the Rhine front and in Britannia as well. Hotbeds of sedition and invasion and plundering and raiding. Constantinople, after all, is in the east, despite being quote-unquote centrally located. The founding of Constantinople did allow the empire to thrive in the east, however, it did, in the end, kind of doom the west. So those are all of the points for the Constantinian Dynasty that I'd like to go over, and that's also all of the points from the Julio-Claudian Dynasty that I've now gone over. So where does this leave us? Well, now I will unveil who I believe to be the greatest Roman dynasty. One thing that I found when doing this was that very much so it became a comparison between Augustus and Constantine themselves, which I think is a very interesting debate to be had. But again, we're looking at the bigger picture here. We're looking at the dynasties. So in the next slide, if I'm constantly referring specifically to Augustus, also remember that I'm also referring to the dynasty as a whole. So without further ado, who do you think it's going to be? This painting, by the way, is called The Age of Augustus and the Birth of Christ by Jean-Léon Gérôme. So in case you couldn't tell, my vote is for the Julio-Claudian Dynasty as being the better dynasty. There's quite a bit to say here, but one idea that I want to keep in mind as we go through my points here of why I chose the Julio-Claudian Dynasty is remember the vision. There's a vision of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty and a vision of the Constantinian Dynasty. Both of these dynasties have a vision for how their dynasty will play out. While Constantine, and this is where I'll go into my points here, why I made the choice that I made. While Constantine as an individual may have been greater than Augustus as an individual, more of a self-made man, able to dictate military and political orders deftly, what Augustus did is not even closely paralleled by Constantine. It's really hard to make the equation that they're both equal. I put a lot of weight into Constantine's failures to preserve his dynasty and the empire by killing Crispus and redividing the empire. That weighs a lot in my mind. Those are great failures that I would say each measure up to something like the loss at the Teutoburg. And even then, that was only not so much just the loss, but the actual failure to kind of recommit. Well, Constantine actively killed Crispus, unfortunately, Augustus had to run the gambit to make sure that he had somebody who was prepared, and eventually he had to settle on Tiberius. It wasn't that it wasn't that Augustus was uninterested in who his successor was going to be. He was very interested, and unfortunately at about every turn he was foiled by, well, disease, as sad as that is, or assassination. Even if Constantine's vision was one god, one empire, one emperor, and I think that that's a very easy way to summarize what Constantine did and what ideas he may have had when he was the emperor, he really didn't have any part in seeing it advance beyond his rule. And of course, by redividing the empire amongst his children, not all of whom were of Nicene persuasion, we see that he's dividing up, again, the empire, emperors, and one god, right? These are all being redivided. Augustus, on the other hand, definitely did close the era of civil wars that had plagued Rome for almost 70 years up to that point. I mean, it had been constant conflict, or near constant. The empire after the Constantinians was not in better shape than before. The Constantinians kind of just really preserved it, and even really Constantine's time was just kind of bringing back a status quo of non-violence at all times. Augustus's vision of Pax Romana, on the other hand, would hold for 200 years, spanning 3 imperial dynasties. I mean, it's unbelievable when you look in comparison. Asking which emperor was greater is a harder question than I think asking which dynasty is greater, because then you have to make the personal comparison between Augustus and Constantine. And I think that there is a very strong argument to make that Constantine as an individual might have been greater than Augustus. But in terms of dynasties, I think it's very clear that the Julio-Claudian Dynasty really holds a lot more weight as being the greater dynasty. And so these are 2 memes here that I've kind of thought about in thinking about how we're to look at this. And I would say we have 2 comparisons here. The first is Pax Romana versus one god, one empire, one emperor. And the other one is finding a city of brick and leaving it a city of marble versus leaving a city of marble to make another city of marble. The Pax Romana obviously endured, whereas the idea of one god, one empire, one emperor would endure. In actual fact, it did not endure well after Constantine's time. And again, finding a city of brick and making it a city of marble is definitely a personal achievement of Augustus and of the Julio-Claudian dynasty as a whole. And in comparison, founding Constantinople was definitely Constantine's work as an individual, but I don't think that it outweighs everything else. Pax Romana endures. Constantine's ideas, while his ideas endure, in actual fact, they do not survive. Augustus's vision does succeed and lasts. Well, Constantine's vision only lasted about a generation or 2. Constantine's vision, in comparison, flickered and burnt out, while Augustus's would thrive for 200 years. While Constantine would build Constantinople as a city of marble to rival and perhaps surpass Rome, Augustus brought Rome from a city of brick to a city of marble, which is, well, probably a lot more difficult. Augustus and the Julio-Claudians are greater than the Constantinians in my book. It's as simple as that. And I mean, if you had no other beliefs, you would have to point to the fact that Jesus, our Lord and Savior, chose to be born during the reign of Augustus and during the time of the Julio-Claudians. So, with that brings to an end my 3-part series here. If you enjoyed it, well, let me know. And if you disagreed or you agreed, I'd like to hear your opinions and what you think was correct or what you think was incorrect. So, let me know. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope that this has kind of spurred on a bit of a desire to continue to learn about Roman history. Anyways, with that all out of the way, thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.